Let me just give a quick update. I know many of you have been praying for Catherine, and it's been quite an ordeal. On Wednesday, a week ago, or almost past a week, that she woke up and was in a great deal of pain and could not walk. And as we called the squad to come and take her to ER, the squad recommended that she just call the doctor's office and get some pain meds, because that's all they would do in the ER for her. They would give her pain meds and send her to back to her doctor. Thanksgiving, she could not move and was in bed all day. In fact, we were to be up in Toledo for our family Thanksgiving. A neighbor brought us some turkey and some stuffing, and we had Thanksgiving in bed. On Friday, we called the doctor's office, and they said, go straight to the ER, which we did. They did the test, the MRIs, and the bottom line is that for whatever reason, her back, which the discs are stacked domino-wise, looks like somebody just whacked them Jenga or whatever the case might be. Discs were, the bones were slipped to the side, and the discs were everywhere. So they had to do surgery, and they fused up through L5, I think, or 6, with 8 screws, 2 rods, and they put mesh cages around the discs so that they would not move and would be contained. Surgery was 7 hours, a little over 7 hours, and upon completion of the surgery, now she's in the recovery phase. They did send her home, which meant that she met the minimum requirements, and so we're caring for her at home. Our son yesterday said, when he was there to help, he said, "Dad," he says, "your place looks like a nursing home. We got walkers and wheelchairs and all kinds of things that I guess we're needing." So please keep her in your prayers, as she's being told it'll be a good minimum 8, possibly 12 weeks of recovery for this surgery. Needless to say, I try to look at the bright side of things, and it fits right into the sermon today, because Catherine and I have been on a journey this last week, a journey of getting her back to health. And as I mentioned previously, that as I look at the story, the Christmas story, everybody's on the move. Everybody's on a road trip. Everybody's experiencing something, and they're moving from this place to this place. Almost a story within a story. I've mentioned before, we read the words of the Bible, and we believe them, and they're guides for us. But there's stories behind the words, and there's stories behind the stories that help us if we are brave enough to dig deeper and to let our own understanding and interpretations go. We find that the stories are more relevant for us today than the simple words that we read. Last week we looked at the wise men, these scholarly people who came from a pagan background, traveled a great distance, and then witnessed for themselves this incredible promised king that they read about in Hebrew scriptures. And you see, that in itself is a miracle, but the fact that they were guided by a star. It talks about, it reminds us that maybe there's a star that is a spiritual star, or something that we should be looking to that can guide our lives. Looking to the Bible, looking to God, looking to imitate, as Paul says, Christ. But today we come to another story, because I remember all of these stories that continually seep into my mind and seep into my life and actually change my life. You see, I remember growing up as a child in Indonesia. And I remember it was our family tradition that every Christmas morning, before we would eat, before we would open any gifts, we would gather in the near or around the tree. These things were in plain sight. The food was on the table ready. The gifts were wrapped and were just begging to be opened. And yet, my father would sit in a chair, my mother beside him, and us kids at their feet as my dad opened the Bible to the Gospel of Luke. And he would begin in those days. And he would read through the Christmas story. And then he would get to the point and he would jump back in the pages to Matthew and he would read about the wise men that traveled far and would come at part of the story. But I remember with such vividness that whenever we got to that point to where Joseph and Mary traveled from Nazareth to Bethlehem, and they were seeking a place to stay, he would pause at that place to where he would read, oftentimes with a quiver in his voice. No room. No room for them in the inn. And then he would pause in the story. Mind you, we were living in, I was growing up and we were living in Indonesia. He would pause in that story and remind us that in our house there would always be room for anyone who came. I cannot tell you the number of times that late night, early morning, there would be a knock on the door of our house. Someone that my parents didn't know, had never seen, had never heard of, saying, "Are you Bill and Barb Myers? We need a place." No questions asked. The door was open. They were welcome in. Normally the process would be either me or my brother would be woken up and we'd be moved into the other's room to make room for the stranger that was there. No questions asked. You know, I wonder a little bit about those, because we saw it from our perspective and our side of the equation that we were in a safe place, in a warm and dry room with food to eat if we got hungry. But I wonder what would happen if I was looking at it on the other side of the equation. You see, the people that we would see, I would see as a child, that as they came into our house, were people who were tired and weary and worn out from travel. They'd been on the road long enough to where it wasn't any excitement in their faces. It was more of a, I don't know what else to do. I remember a time when Catherine and myself and our kids took a trip out to Iowa to spend time with Catherine's parents. And I can remember we didn't get more than 15 minutes down the road before all the kids were bored. And Catherine trying to keep them kind of halfway in place, that she was showing fatigue. And we hadn't even made it out of the state of Michigan. I remember the trip that we tried to take down to Florida, only to find out that the pass that goes to West Virginia was closed. They had a storm that came through and the roads were impassable. And as we said, we'll stop and we'll pick up the trip in the morning when they get salt on the roads, only to find out that there's no room. I mean, I still am haunted by the words that I have a wife and 3 kids in the van saying, sorry, friend, we have no vacancy. And where will we go? What will we do? Oh, I went back and I remembered the time that Catherine and I decided that we would respond to the call that God had placed on our lives. We lived in Mansfield in a small house that had 9 acres of apple trees. Catherine had a job at Mansfield General Hospital. I had a job working for a produce company, delivering produce and driving a truck. Life was good. We'd just given birth to our firstborn, Benjamin. And all of a sudden, God says, I want you to be a pastor. And I said, I don't think so. Life is good. We just bought our first 1976 Mustang and drove it right off the showroom floor. I mean, truly, God was with us. But I remember the call being so strong that I even placed it back in God's hands, and I said, if you want me to go from here to there, then you're going to have to convince her. And wouldn't you know, it wasn't more than a week after that, Catherine said, I've been thinking, Gordon, maybe we should consider ministry. I remember taking that trip, selling everything we had, renting a 12-foot U-Haul trailer, buying an old 1973 Plymouth Fury so it could haul the trailer, getting rid of the one possession that we truly love, that Mustang, and leaving on the trip up to Minnesota, not knowing anybody, having $200 in my pocket, and a newborn son. Only arriving at the college for them to say, I'm sorry, we're closed. We have no students on campus during Christmas break. I remember looking at the papers and looking for places to rent, and as we called places, they're saying, sorry, we've already rented them. I remember calling the last place we were going to call before we would spend our last $200 on a motel room that night, with no credit cards back then, mind you. That the person said, I've got this place that was listed. It's about 6 months old. I've not heard anything on it. You want me to call them? And that's where we ended up staying. For 2 years. You see, sometimes when we move from here to there, it's a bit of uncertainty. I can imagine Mary thinking, am I going to give birth as we're making this trek from Nazareth to Bethlehem? I can imagine others saying, you know what, should you be traveling in this condition? Why don't you just stay here? They'll never know that you didn't register. And besides that, government bureaucracy is slow unless you owe them money. You see, Jesus' events here and now, as he was living through that journey from Nazareth to Bethlehem, as he was about to find out internally that there was no room for him at the inn, that would be a mantra of his life. I mean, just stop and think for a moment. This blew my mind because the more I thought about it, the more real it became to me. You see, not only was he rejected for a place where he could give birth, but he also was rejected in the economic world of his day. He had to borrow, if you remember, a boat to cross the lake. He didn't have one of his own. Do you remember Easter time we celebrate? He didn't even have a ride into Jerusalem. He had to borrow a donkey to ride. He didn't have a tomb that he could be buried in. He had to have a tomb loaned to him. What I learned from just going through that short exercise as I was preparing these words, that Jesus lived on the generosity of others because he had so little himself. And because of that, he could boldly say, folks, you don't need what you got. God's got it all covered. So sell whatever you have and give it to those who are poor. Oh, loan money, he says, to those who can't pay it back to you. Oh, pay your taxes like you're supposed to, but don't forget God's house. Oh, he goes on to say, I've seen people that have hoarded things. They don't last here. They decay. So it's better to put your treasures in safekeeping up in heaven. But you see, no one wanted a policy like that. It started at the beginning of his birth. No room. No room. Doors that were slammed into his face throughout his ministry. And when things didn't go right, he didn't go blaming people. He talked about the transformations that could take place because of failed policies. Instead of segregating those who are rich and those that are poor. Instead of segregating those who are politically correct and those who are not, according to some. He did just the opposite. Instead of saying there's no room, he invited all to come. All who are burdened with heavy loads. He ate with known sinners, and you know what? He enjoyed it. Those that were unclean, he touched them. He told stories where the Samaritans were the good guys, where landlords paid equal wages to someone who had only worked 1 hour in the day. He was the first one to treat women with dignity. And if you remember, he said, your faith and your religion is nothing unless you became like a child. What is a child like? They can't provide for themselves. He talked about a kingdom that was not of this world. He talked about the meek leading the strong. He talked about the sinners that would be forgiven. It's no wonder there was no room in their lives. I mean, would you want a Messiah that says to you, love your enemies? Or a Messiah that says you don't need to be chairs of committees? That's not where the power is. The power is in the Holy Spirit that transforms lives. You don't need a deliverer who will stand before you, but you need a deliverer who is in you. And there was no room. There was no room in the religious realm for Jesus as well. He said that if you want to come and follow me, it's going to cost you everything. And he said that's the only way. You can't pick and choose and take forks in the road and expect to get there. There's no shortcut to a life that's filled with God's love. He healed people that wasn't supposed to be healed. And he said that knowing God was more than just an idea, but it actually had to have a transformation. It was more than just having big buildings that you could brag about. It was about service to others. It was about love for everyone. And it was about sacrifice from self. Things that we're trying to incorporate here at SUMC. And he brought people into the mission who didn't really know how to do it yet. Think of the 12 disciples. It's no wonder he was not welcomed in the world of his day. It's no wonder there was no room in the inn. You see, it hadn't been the kind of celebration that most had expected. Just a few unkept shepherds, a wild story about angels telling them what's going to happen, some wise men that traveled thousands of miles. It's about Joseph and Mary taking this trip by faith, not being able to imagine where this would take them and their lives. They would have feelings in it. I might say that there might be feelings that you and I have had. Maybe feelings of anger when they were told there was no room in the inn. I began to wonder, will there be room for him in our lives? Or let me be more specific. Will there be room for this newborn Messiah that will change the way that I act and think in the same way that he changed the ways in his lifetime? And let me even be more specific. Will there be room in your life? I'm taking the journey. I don't know whether you will when you find out what it really cost. I hope you will. And I pray there will be room in the life of this church for the Savior to work. Let's not get all bogged up in things. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. You can't do this, you can't do that. Let's make room for Jesus. So that Jesus can transform our lives and our community.